Marcus Webb had exactly 3 rules for surviving as a maintenance worker on New Eden Station. Fix it fast, fix it quiet, and never, ever volunteer for extra shifts. So naturally, when he opened Storage Bay 7 Alpha at dark 30 in the morning and found 2 furry alien creatures the size of house cats staring back at him, his first thought was not, "Aw, how cute." His first thought was, "This is definitely not in my job description." The creatures looked like someone had crossbred a tiger cub with a particularly angry tribble, complete with oversized paws, needle-sharp claws, and eyes that seemed way too intelligent for comfort. They also had this disconcerting habit of tilting their heads in perfect synchronization, like they were downloading his soul or calculating the best angle to bite his ankles. "Well, this is just fantastic," Marcus muttered, consulting his work tablet. "Storage bay maintenance," they said. "Quick inventory check," they said. Nothing about alien daycare services. The cubs, because that's obviously what they were, made soft chirping sounds. That would have been adorable if Marcus hadn't recognized the distinctive ridged spines running down their backs. Those spines belonged to exactly one species in the known galaxy, the Cathara. You know, those charming folks who'd conquered half the outer rim by literally eating their enemies. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," Marcus said, backing toward the exit. "Of all the abandoned pets in all the storage bays in all the galaxy, I had to find the baby death machines." But here's the thing about baby death machines. They're still babies. And these 2 looked cold, hungry, and absolutely pathetic. The smaller one was actually shivering, which shouldn't have been possible since the bay was heated, but apparently even apex predator cubs could master the art of looking pitiful when necessary. Marcus stood there for a full minute, having an internal debate that basically boiled down to walk away and pretend this never happened versus great, now I'm responsible for 2 creatures that will probably grow up to eat me. His conscience, which had gotten him into trouble more times than he could count, decided to make an executive decision. "Fine," he sighed, pulling off his maintenance jacket. "But I'm naming you Chompers and Bitey, and if you grow up and eat me, I'm haunting both of you." The cubs perked up immediately, their synchronized head tilts switching to what Marcus could only describe as cautious optimism. When he wrapped them in his jacket, they didn't fight or scratch. Instead, they snuggled closer to his chest and made contented rumbling sounds that vibrated through his ribcage like tiny, murderous, purring engines. What Marcus didn't know, as he carried his new responsibilities back to his quarters, was that 3 decks down, Commander Vex Thornscale of the Cathara Imperial Fleet was having what humans might politely call a complete nervous breakdown. The 7-foot-tall apex predator had been searching New Eden Station for 6 hours, following scent trails that kept going cold, and trying very hard not to terrorize the human crew while looking for 2 very important missing cubs. Cubs who, at that very moment, were discovering that humans made surprisingly comfortable heating pads, and that this particular human smelled like metal polish, coffee, and something indefinably safe. Marcus had planned to do the responsible thing the next morning, march straight to the xenobiology department, hand over the cubs, and let someone with actual qualifications deal with the situation. This plan lasted approximately 30 seconds after he woke up to find Chompers and Bitey had somehow escaped his makeshift cardboard box fort and were now sleeping on his chest, purring like tiny chainsaws. "Okay, new plan," he wheezed, carefully extracting himself from under 20 pounds of clingy alien predator. "We find your real parents, you go home, and I pretend this whole thing never happened." The cubs watched him with those unsettling golden eyes as he got dressed, occasionally chirping at each other in what sounded suspiciously like commentary. When Marcus headed for the door, they trotted after him with the confidence of creatures who'd obviously decided this human belonged to them now. "No, no, no," Marcus said, pointing at his quarters. "You stay here. I'll be back with help." Chompers sat down and gave him a look that clearly said, "Yeah, right, buddy." Bitey just walked directly between Marcus's legs and positioned herself in front of the door like a furry, adorable roadblock. 10 minutes later, Marcus was walking through the corridors of New Eden with 2 alien cubs trailing behind him, like the galaxy's most dangerous ducklings. Every crew member they passed did a double-take that progressed from, "Aw, cute pets," to, "Wait, are those what I think they are?" to, "Why is Marcus walking around with baby-killing machines?" Dr. Elena Vasquez, the station's chief xenobiologist, nearly dropped her coffee when Marcus knocked on her lab door. She was a brilliant woman who'd spent her career studying the galaxy's most dangerous species, but even she blinked twice when she saw what he'd brought her. "Marcus," she said carefully, "please tell me those aren't Cathara cubs." "Okay, they're not Cathar cubs. Are you lying to make me feel better?" "Absolutely." Dr. Vasquez set down her coffee very slowly. Where did you find them? Storage Bay 7 Alpha. They were just sitting there, looking pathetic and probably plotting my demise. As if summoned by the mention of their discovery, both cubs chirped simultaneously and padded over to Dr. Vasquez, but instead of investigating her like normal, curious animals, they positioned themselves between her and Marcus, their little bodies tense with protective instinct. Oh, this is bad, Dr. Vasquez muttered, pulling up her research files. Marcus, I think they've imprinted on you. Imprinted? Like, decided I'm their mom? More like decided you're their pack alpha. Cathara cubs bond with whoever they perceive as their protector during their first vulnerable period. It's an evolutionary survival mechanism that makes them fiercely loyal to someone who can keep them alive, Marcus finished, watching Bitey growl softly at a perfectly innocent lab stool. Great, so they think I'm their leader now. It's worse than that. They think you're their family, and Cathara family bonds are, let's call them permanent. As if to prove her point, Chompers wandered over to Marcus's leg and rubbed against it, while purring, leaving behind a scent mark that would probably take industrial-strength detergent to remove. Meanwhile, Bitey had discovered Dr. Vasquez's lunch and was methodically shredding the sandwich wrapper with the focus of a creature born to hunt. So what you're telling me, Marcus said, is that I'm now the proud parent of 2 apex predators who will grow up to be 7 feet tall and capable of crushing steel with their bare hands? Well, when you put it like that, it sounds bad. How else would I put it? Dr. Vasquez didn't have an answer for that. Mainly because at that moment, the lab's emergency proximity alarm started blaring, which meant something large and potentially hostile was approaching the station. Something that was probably looking for 2 very specific missing cubs. Marcus had always imagined that meeting the parent of his hypothetical children would involve awkward small talk over dinner, not standing in his quarters while a 7-foot-tall apex predator filled his doorway like a nightmare made of muscle, claws, and barely contained parental anxiety. Commander Vex Thornscale was everything the horror stories said Cathara warriors were. Imposing, deadly, and covered in enough natural weaponry to stock a medieval armory. What the stories hadn't mentioned was that this particular warrior was also clearly a worried parent, which somehow made the situation both less terrifying and infinitely more complicated. Human, Vex rumbled in accented standard, golden eyes scanning Marcus's quarters with military precision. You have cubs that belong to me. Marcus gestured toward his bed, where Chompers and Bitey were curled up in his laundry basket like the galaxy's most dangerous house cats. Yeah, about that. I found them in Storage Bay 7 Alpha. They were cold and hungry, so He never got to finish the explanation, because Vex had already crossed the room in 2 strides and was reaching for the cubs. The reunion should have been heartwarming, parent and children, together again. Instead, what happened next could only be described as an intergalactic incident. The moment Vex's claws touched the laundry basket, both cubs erupted in a symphony of angry chittering that sounded like a broken garbage disposal having an argument with itself. Chompers scrambled out of the basket and planted himself directly in front of Marcus's legs, while Bitey actually hissed at her own parent like Vex was some kind of stranger trying to steal her favorite toy. What in the 17 hells, Vex muttered, staring at cubs who were clearly choosing a random human over their actual flesh and blood. Yeah, so apparently they've imprinted on me, Marcus said, trying to sound casual while 2 baby predators used him as a shield against their own mother. Dr. Vasquez says it's some kind of pack bonding thing. Vex's expression shifted through several emotions that didn't have names in standard but probably translated to confused, offended, and what do you mean my children prefer this hairless maintenance worker? When she tried again to approach the cubs, Bitey actually growled, which, coming from something the size of a house cat, shouldn't have been intimidating, but somehow managed to convey serious, back-off energy. This is impossible, Vex said, settling into what Marcus could only describe as an aggressive crouch. Cubs return to their birth parent. It is natural law. Well, apparently your kids didn't get the memo. What followed was the most surreal 20 minutes of Marcus's life, which was saying something considering he'd once had to explain to his supervisor why the waste recycling system was clogged with what turned out to be an alien plant that achieved sentience every 3rd Tuesday. Vex tried everything, authoritative rumbling that should have commanded instant obedience, offering food that the cubs ignored in favor of Marcus's emergency ration bars, and even attempting to physically pick them up, which resulted in both cubs clinging to Marcus's legs like furry clawed barnacles. Perhaps, Marcus suggested carefully, we could try a gradual transition, like visitation rights? Vex fixed him with a stare that could have melted titanium. You wish to negotiate custody of my offspring. I wish to not get eaten by you while also not traumatizing your kids. The standoff was interrupted by Chompers, who had apparently decided the adults were being ridiculous. The cub padded over to Vex, chirped once in what sounded like reproach, then returned to Marcus and climbed up his leg to perch on his shoulder. The message was clear. This is my human. Deal with it. Vex sat back on her haunches and made a sound that Marcus really hoped was laughter rather than the prelude to violence. Human Marcus Webb, she said, and the fact that she knew his full name was either impressive intelligence gathering or deeply concerning. It appears my cubs have claimed you as their pack leader. Is that good or bad? Among my people, it means you are now responsible for their safety, their training, and their honor. Marcus looked at Chompers, who was currently trying to eat his hair, then at Bitey, who had discovered his coffee mug and was batting at it with scientific curiosity. So basically, I'm their dad now. Essentially, yes. And if I mess this up? Vex's smile revealed teeth that belonged in a horror movie. Then I eat you. Right, no pressure. Marcus thought his day couldn't get any worse. This was before Station Administrator Reginald Pemberton arrived at his quarters with a clipboard, a nervous expression, and the kind of bureaucratic determination that could turn a simple misunderstanding into a galactic incident. Webb, Pemberton announced, not even bothering to acknowledge the 7-foot alien warrior currently occupying most of Marcus's living space. We need to discuss your unauthorized pet situation. Marcus watched Chompers, who had taken one look at Pemberton's perfectly pressed uniform and decided it needed immediate investigation via tiny claws. They're not exactly pets, sir. According to Regulation 77 Alpha, no station personnel may harbor potentially dangerous alien species without proper documentation, quarantine protocols, and insurance coverage that frankly doesn't exist for creatures capable of eating their way through a bulkhead. Vex made a sound that was definitely not laughter this time. You question the honor of Kethara cubs? I question the liability of having them loose on my station, Pemberton shot back, apparently deciding that diplomatic courtesy was less important than his insurance premiums. Do you have any idea what the Galactic Safety Commission would do to us if they found out we're harboring undocumented apex predators? This was precisely the wrong thing to say. Bitey, who had been contentedly shredding one of Marcus's old maintenance manuals, suddenly went very still, her golden eyes fixed on Pemberton with the kind of focus that suggested she was calculating the exact trajectory needed to reach his ankles in one pounce. Sir, Marcus said carefully, maybe we could discuss this somewhere else? Absolutely not. This situation ends now. Either these creatures are removed from the station immediately, or you're all expelled on the next transport. What happened next would later be known in New Eden Station lore as the Great Administrative Rampage of Storage Deck 5. Bitey, apparently taking Pemberton's threat as a direct challenge to her newly adopted human, launched herself from Marcus's workbench directly at the administrator's clipboard. Now, Pemberton was a career bureaucrat who had survived budget meetings, safety inspections, and 3 different hostile takeovers of the station's management company. What he was not prepared for was 20 pounds of indignant alien cub treating his official documentation like a personal enemy. Get it off! Get it off! Pemberton shrieked, dancing around Marcus's quarters while Bitey systematically destroyed every piece of paper in his possession. Forms scattered like confetti, regulation manuals became chew toys, and his precious clipboard became the focus of what could only be described as a surgical demolition project. Chompers, not to be outdone, decided that Pemberton's shoes were clearly a threat to Marcus's safety and began a coordinated attack on his bootlaces. Within 30 seconds, the station administrator was hopping on one foot, trying to shake off a determined cub while his entire regulatory arsenal was reduced to bureaucratic confetti. This is exactly what I was talking about, Pemberton yelled, finally managing to extract himself from the chaos and retreating to the relative safety of Marcus's doorway. These creatures are a menace. That's when Vex stood up. The Kethara warrior had been watching the entire scene with what Marcus was beginning to recognize as parental pride, mixed with tactical assessment. When she rose to her full height, her head nearly touched the ceiling, and suddenly Pemberton's complaints about dangerous aliens took on a whole new perspective. Administrator Pemberton, Vex said, with the kind of calm that preceded either diplomacy or dismemberment. You have insulted my cubs. I have regulations to uphold. And I have honor to defend. Marcus, meanwhile, was trying to restore order by collecting both cubs, who were now sitting in the remains of Pemberton's paperwork looking extremely pleased with themselves. Chompers had somehow managed to get his tiny head stuck in a regulation binder, while Bitey was wearing what appeared to be a requisition form like a very official hat. "Look," Marcus said, attempting to be the voice of reason while extracting Chompers from his paper prison. "Maybe we can work something out. The cubs aren't hurting anyone. They might just destroy 6 months of regulatory documentation. Okay, they're not hurting anyone important." Dr. Vasquez chose that moment to appear in the doorway, probably drawn by the sounds of bureaucratic destruction. She took one look at the scene, paper everywhere, Pemberton disheveled and missing a shoelace, Vex radiating menace, and Marcus holding 2 very satisfied cubs, and pulled out her scanner. "Fascinating," she murmured, taking readings. "Marcus, the cubs' stress hormones are completely normal. In fact, they're showing signs of protective behavior." "Protective of what?" Pemberton demanded. "Of Marcus. They weren't being destructive for fun. They perceived you as a threat to their pack leader and responded accordingly." Vex's expression shifted to something that might have been respect. "The cubs choose to defend their human. This is unexpected but honorable behavior." "Great," Marcus muttered, looking down at Chompers and Bitey, who were now purring contentedly in his arms. "So not only have they adopted me, they're willing to fight bureaucracy for me." "Which brings us back to the original problem," Pemberton said, trying to reassemble what was left of his dignity and his paperwork. "Regulations clearly state—" He never got to finish because the station's emergency klaxons suddenly blared to life, accompanied by the automated announcement that every space station resident dreaded. "Hostile vessels detected. All personnel to emergency stations. This is not a drill." Marcus looked at the cubs, who had gone from playful to alert in seconds, their ears perked and golden eyes scanning for threats. Vex was already moving toward the door, every inch the warrior she was bred to be. "Well," Marcus said to no one in particular, "at least now we have bigger problems than paperwork." Marcus had been through 3 pirate attacks during his time on New Eden Station, and they all followed the same predictable pattern. Lots of dramatic posturing over the comm system, some half-hearted weapons fire to show they were serious, followed by negotiations that usually ended with the pirates accepting a protection fee and moving on to easier targets. This attack was different. For starters, the pirates weren't bothering with demands or negotiations. The first Marcus knew of their intentions was when the entire station shuddered under weapons fire that was definitely not half-hearted, followed by the distinctive sound of hull breaches that meant someone was coming aboard whether the station liked it or not. "Emergency stations, my foot," Marcus muttered, clutching Chompers and Bitey as another explosion rocked the corridor. "More like emergency funeral preparations." Vex had disappeared the moment the attack began, presumably to do whatever Cathara warriors did when faced with hostile borders, which probably involved a lot of violence and very little paperwork. Dr. Vasquez had grabbed her emergency medical kit and headed for the evacuation points, leaving Marcus alone with 2 alien cubs and a growing certainty that his maintenance clearance didn't cover repelling borders. The cubs, however, seemed to have different ideas about the situation. Chompers had gone completely still in Marcus's arms, his golden eyes fixed on something Marcus couldn't see or hear. Bitey was making a sound Marcus had never heard before. Not a purr, not a chirp, but something that seemed to vibrate through the deck plating and make his teeth ache. "Okay, guys, I know this is scary," Marcus said, trying to project calm while internally calculating their chances of reaching the evacuation pods. "But we need to get to safety before—" The corridor lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a second later, bathing everything in hellish red, and that's when Marcus heard the footsteps. Heavy boots, multiple sets, moving with the kind of coordination that spoke of military training turned to less legal purposes. The pirates weren't just raiding cargo holds. They were conducting a systematic sweep of the station. Marcus pressed himself against the wall, trying to become invisible while holding 2 cubs who had suddenly become very, very quiet, the kind of quiet that predators used when they were hunting. "Check every room," a rough voice called out in Galactic Standard. "Boss wants prisoners, but dead works just as well if they give us trouble." The footsteps were getting closer. Marcus could see the sweep of weapon lights playing across the corridor junction ahead, and he realized with the kind of crystal clarity that came with impending doom that there was nowhere to run. The evacuation route led directly through the pirate's search pattern, and his quarters were a dead end. That's when Bitey slipped out of his arms. "No, wait," Marcus whispered, but the cub was already moving, padding silently toward the corridor junction with a grace that didn't belong to something that had been playing with shoelaces 20 minutes earlier. Chompers followed a second later, and Marcus watched in horror as his adopted alien children walked directly toward armed pirates, like they were going to ask for belly rubs. The first pirate rounded the corner and found himself face to face with two creatures the size of house cats. Marcus could see the man's confusion even from his hiding spot. These didn't look like threats. They looked like the kind of exotic pets that rich collectors kept in climate-controlled habitat. The pirate made the mistake of reaching for Bitey. What happened next defied every cute animal video Marcus had ever seen. Bitey didn't scratch or bite like a normal angry cat. Instead, she moved like liquid death, flowing up the pirate's arm faster than human reflexes could track. The man's scream cut off abruptly when 20 pounds of apex predator cub found his throat with precision that spoke of millions of years of evolutionary refinement. Chompers, not to be outdone, had discovered that human ankles were apparently considered vital structural components. The second pirate went down hard, weapon clattering across the deck as he discovered that baby Cathara claws could punch through combat boots like they were made of tissue paper. The third pirate, showing more intelligence than his companions, tried to bring his weapon to bear on what he now realized were definitely not cute pets. He never got the chance. Bitey had already finished with pirate number 1 and was airborne again, moving in an arc that would have made a professional gymnast weep with envy. Marcus watched the entire engagement from his hiding spot, and the thing that struck him wasn't the violence, though there was certainly plenty of that. It was the cubs' tactical coordination. They moved like they'd been planning this assault for weeks instead of seconds, covering each other's approaches, eliminating threats in order of priority, and doing it all with the kind of efficient brutality that made Marcus understand exactly why the Cathara had conquered half the galaxy. When the corridor fell silent again, both cubs trotted back to Marcus like they'd just finished a particularly satisfying game of fetch. Chompers had somehow acquired a pirate's combat knife, which he dropped at Marcus's feet like a cat bringing its owner a dead mouse. Bitey was purring again, the same contented sound she made when he scratched behind her ears. "Okay," Marcus said weakly, looking at two alien cubs who had just demonstrated that they were, in fact, baby-killing machines. That was educational. More footsteps echoed from deeper in the station, but these were different, heavier, more purposeful, and accompanied by sounds that suggested the remaining pirates were having a very bad day. Vex, apparently, had found them. The cubs perked up at the familiar sounds, chirping excitedly as their birth parents' roars echoed through the corridors. But when Marcus started to move toward the sounds of battle, both cubs positioned themselves in front of him again, their message clear. Their human was staying right where it was safe, thank you very much. "You know what?" Marcus said, settling back against the wall while explosions and screams provided an oddly comforting soundtrack. "I think I'm starting to understand this whole pack leader thing." Chompers curled up in his lap, still purring. Bitey took up a guard position where she could watch both approaches to their corridor, and Marcus realized that being adopted by the galaxy's apex predators might have more advantages than he'd originally thought. After all, how many maintenance workers could say their kids had personally defeated a pirate boarding party? 3 weeks later, Marcus Webb found himself in what he could only describe as the most surreal staff meeting of his career. The New Eden Station conference room had been hastily reconfigured to accommodate Vex, who took up roughly the same amount of space as a small shuttle, while Chompers and Bitey had claimed the chair next to Marcus and were currently engaged in what appeared to be a heated debate over who got to shred the meeting agenda. "So," Administrator Pemberton said, consulting a tablet that had replaced his beloved clipboard after what was now officially referred to as the incident, "let's review our current situation. We have a human maintenance worker who has been legally adopted by 2 Cathara cubs according to their species customs, a Cathara military commander who has requested extended leave to serve as cultural liaison, and a complete restructuring of our interspecies relations protocols." "You forgot the part where my kids saved the station," Marcus pointed out, gently extracting what looked like an expense report from Bitey's claws. "That should probably go in the official record." "Your cubs," Pemberton corrected, with the weary tone of a man who had given up fighting the inevitable. "Eliminated 6 armed pirates, disabled their boarding craft, and somehow managed to do it without damaging any critical station infrastructure. They're very considerate," Marcus said proudly, watching Chompers attempt to eat a stylus. "Always clean up after themselves." Dr. Vasquez looked up from her notes, where she'd been documenting what she called the most significant case of interspecies bonding in recorded history. "The cubs' protective behavior has actually stabilized remarkably. Their stress hormones are within normal ranges as long as Marcus is present, and they've shown they can distinguish between actual threats and routine station operations." "Routine operations," Vex rumbled from her corner. do not typically involve bureaucrats waving clipboards at pack leaders. Pemberton had the grace to look embarrassed. Yes, well, we've updated our protocols regarding that. What those protocols now included was a sight that still made Marcus shake his head in disbelief. Every morning at 0700 hours, he reported for his maintenance duties, accompanied by 2 alien cubs and their 7-foot warrior mother, who had somehow managed to squeeze herself into a station uniform that looked like it had been designed for someone considerably smaller and less heavily armed. Vex had adapted to civilian life with the same tactical precision she brought to everything else. She'd memorized the station's entire layout within 48 hours, established what she called patrol routes through the corridors, and had somehow convinced the quartermaster to stock the commissary with what she described as proper nutrition for growing cubs, which apparently involved a lot of raw protein and very little of what humans considered normal food. The Galactic Safety Commission has reviewed our incident reports, Pemberton continued, and they've classified New Eden Station as the first successful example of human Kethura integration. We're apparently being held up as a model for future diplomatic relations. No pressure there, Marcus muttered, then yelped as Bitey decided his hand looked more interesting than the meeting materials. Her teeth were getting bigger every day along with the rest of her, and Dr. Vasquez estimated that within 6 months both cubs would be the size of earth wolves. Within 2 years, they'd be approaching adult Cathara proportions, which meant Marcus was going to need a bigger apartment. The housing department has approved your request for expanded quarters, Pemberton said, apparently reading his mind. Deck 7, Section C. It comes with reinforced walls, climate control, and what the previous tenant described as adequate space for large pets. The previous tenant, Vex added with what might have been amusement, was a Gorvani merchant who kept domesticated pack hunters as companions. The space should be suitable. Marcus looked down at Chompers, who had given up on the stylus and was now investigating the fascinating mysteries of Marcus's shoelaces, then over at Bitey, who was sitting in perfect formation next to his chair like a furry, golden-eyed bodyguard. 6 months ago, his biggest concern had been whether the recycling systems were going to break down again before his next scheduled maintenance cycle. Now he was the adoptive father of 2 creatures who would eventually grow large enough to use him as a dental floss, had a 7-foot alien warrior as what amounted to a co-parent, and was apparently a diplomatic success story for the ages. There is one more matter, Vex said, her voice taking on a formal tone that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. Among my people, the bonding ritual requires acknowledgement from the birth parent. Marcus Webb, you have protected my cubs, earned their loyalty, and proven yourself worthy of their trust. I name you pack friend and battle brother, with all rights and responsibilities that such titles entail. What exactly do those titles mean? Marcus asked, though he suspected he wasn't going to like the answer. It means, Vex said with a grin that revealed far too many teeth, that when these cubs reach maturity they will likely bring their own cubs to you for approval. You are now part of our family line for the next several generations. Marcus stared at her. Then he looked down at Chompers and Bitey, who had apparently understood every word, and were now purring so loudly that the conference table was vibrating. So what you're telling me, he said slowly, is that I'm not just adopted, I'm stuck with this job for life. Welcome to parenthood, Dr. Vasquez said with entirely too much amusement, Cathara style. Marcus leaned back in his chair and considered his options. He could panic about the long-term implications, worry about the practical challenges of raising apex predators, or stress about the diplomatic pressure of being an interspecies success story. Instead, he reached down and scratched Bitey behind the ears, earning a contented rumble that sounded suspiciously like thank you. Chompers immediately abandoned his shoelace investigation and climbed up to curl around Marcus's shoulders, purring like a tiny engine. You know what? Marcus said, looking around the table at his new extended family. I've had worse jobs. Outside the conference room windows, New Eden Station continued its slow rotation around a star that didn't care about diplomatic incidents or interspecies adoption protocols. In the corridors, crew members were getting used to nodding politely to a maintenance worker who traveled with an escort of baby predators and their extremely overprotective mother. And in the station's files, Administrator Pemberton was updating Marcus Webb's personnel record to include a note that would probably confuse bureaucrats for generations to come. Employee demonstrates exceptional aptitude for unconventional family management and pirate deterrence. Recommend for promotion to senior maintenance specialist and diplomatic relations consultant. Also approve overtime pay for childcare duties. Some days, Marcus thought, as Chompers tried to groom his hair with a tongue that was getting uncomfortably rough, the universe had a very strange sense of humor. but at least his kids would never have trouble with bullies.